is really to share knowledge, and WHO is very happy to bring on board experts around the world to talk about specific subjects. I think it's important to highlight why we have chosen MERS. As you know, we have declared the end of the public health emergency of international concern for COVID-19 a few days ago. And some people have said on social media that WHO is now taking MERS so that we can maintain the level of anxiety very high everywhere. So I want to say that it's not absolutely not the purpose of this webinar. Really, the purpose is again to share knowledge on a virus that has been with us since 2012, that is quite deadly because an average of 36% mortality. And we know that if we know the risk well, we can manage the risk well as well. And this is the aim really of this webinar, to make sure that we all know what is about MERS, and so that we can manage this risk better. And I would like to tell you an anecdote, personal anecdote, but in 2015, I was called by President Park in Korea to support the government of Korea to deal with the MERS outbreak at that time. It was somehow a small outbreak because at the end they managed to contain it, and they had only 186 cases and around 36 deaths. So it was not a huge outbreak, if I may say, but their country was paralyzed for around 2 months. And I heard for some economical estimates that they lost at least $1 billion. So after this outbreak, Korea decided to strengthen their preparedness, and we helped them to do so, and we provided guidance to how to better strengthen preparedness. In particular, they really supported the Korean Center for Disease Control. And this time, when COVID-19 started, as you remember, maybe Korea was one of the first affected countries with a major amplifying event, starting with the religious community, but they managed to control the outbreak very quickly. And at the end of the day, they were, of course, as everybody on this planet, they were very affected by the pandemic, but it was really well managed and controlled. And so this anecdote is just to say that preparedness counts. Preparedness makes a huge difference. And so that's why it's important to talk about the risk before the crisis happens, because we have an opportunity to get ready for it. And in addition, MERS, the MERS coronavirus, is a virus of the same family as COVID-19. So a lot of the structures, systems, capacities, function that were built during COVID-19 can very well be used for other types of outbreak due to respiratory pathogens. And so I think it's very important to understand these familial viruses, and so that we can put in place the right measures at the right time, so that we have a better world and most of it, a safer world. So with this, I would like to just thank again the experts for joining us today. Thanks my colleagues also to organizing this webinar, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Yubika.
Thank you, Dr. Sylvie, for your opening remarks and words about us to understand more about MERS-CoV and why we brought this webinar to our distinguished public. So having said that, over to Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, who is leading actually the team where MERS-CoV is tackled. So over to you, Maria, please.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Sylvie, for those opening remarks. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes. My name is Maria van Kerkhove, and I am in Sylvie's department, the Department of Epidemic and Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness. And I lead our unit on emerging diseases and zoonoses. One of those is COVID-19. I also happen to be the COVID-19 technical lead, but in my day job, if you will, there's a large number of pathogens that we are constantly looking at in terms of their epidemic and pandemic threat. And the idea is prevention and preparedness as much as we possibly can to prevent these spillover events to becoming big outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. Before the pandemic, I was the MERS coronavirus technical lead. And now this is with Dr. Sophie van Dobschutz, who you will hear from briefly. But I wanted to put in context, building upon what Sylvie has said about MERS coronavirus. When we were working on this prior to the pandemic, a lot of people said to us, you know what, this is just a disease of Saudi Arabia. It's not a disease that affects the world. It's not a disease that the rest of the world is at risk from. And what we know, and you will hear much more about this from the speakers today, is that there is a risk within the Middle East itself, but that risk extends beyond there because of two reasons. Number one, the intermediate host are dromedary camels. And again, you'll hear more about this from the other speakers. And where these dromedary camels are identified in orange in this map. I show you this map because we basically hand drew it several years ago as a piece of advocacy to show that the risk goes beyond one particular country. And over the course of the last 10 years, we've had a number of cases that were infected in one country, but because of the global world, interconnected world that we live in, that risk of that person with that virus can bring that virus somewhere on the other side of the planet within 24 to 48 hours. And Sylvie gave you an example of one of those outbreaks, which was in the Republic of Korea in 2015. And you're right, Sylvie, it was a small, relatively small outbreak, but actually that estimate of the economic impact I've seen is $8 billion over the course of 2 months. And so as an example, the Republic of Korea, when they had another case in 2018, that one exported case did not actually start an outbreak there. And that was part of those preparedness efforts. But the other point I want to make is that the work that has been done for COVID-19, for MERS coronavirus laid a very strong foundation for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID-19. And one example I would like to share is that the lab network that we had pulled together for MERS coronavirus was quickly utilized for SARS-CoV-2. And in fact, at the time, we didn't even know it was called SARS-CoV-2. Malik Paris, who you'll hear from later, is part of that collaboration that has been forged over many years. And very quickly, once we had the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2, PCR assay, basically the recipe, if you will, forgive the word there, of how to produce PCR testing kits, was able to be shared with the world on the 13th of January, 2020, so less than 2 weeks after we learned of this cluster of pneumonia of unknown etiology in China. And that got the whole world started on testing for SARS-CoV-2. And that's building upon collaborations and trust over many, many years. The same thing happened with the vaccine. There was years of vaccine development for MERS coronavirus, and the platforms that were built with this, with mRNA platforms, were quickly utilized for SARS-CoV-2 once we had that full genome sequence. And the second map I would like to show is we've become a little bit more sophisticated in the maps that we have been producing, but this is a draft map of looking at the emergence and spillover risk of pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential. Within this map, MERS coronavirus is one of the layers. And the point of showing this map is that the work that we have done for MERS coronavirus is beneficial and was beneficial for SARS-CoV-2, but it's also beneficial for the next one. And so what we have done in the last 3.5 years for COVID, what we've done over the last 10 years with all of our partners for MERS, what we are doing for influenza, for plague, for arboviruses, this is about pandemic preparedness for the future. So what we want to do is maintain and sustain the gains that have been made over the last several years. And for the general public, we want the general public to know that WHO, with the quadripartite across the different sectors, we are working to make sure that governments are focusing on these types of risks so that we can do better to prevent them becoming large outbreaks in the future. And with that, I'm going to pass over to our speakers. We first will have Dr. Sophie van Dobschutz, who is the new technical lead for MERS coronavirus. She joined us last year, formerly from FAO. We're very grateful to have her. This presentation will be followed by Dr. Imad Al-Mohammadi, who is from the Chief Officer of Communicable Diseases in the Saudi Public Health Authority, a WHO collaborating center for MERS, our only one. And then to Dr. Malik Paris, who's the Professor of Virology in the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. I want to remind you, for those of you who are listening, to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to make sure that we facilitate answering those through the course of the webinar. And back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. Over to Sophie.
Thank you so much. I will take you through the global priorities and available tools for MERS-CoV. And this is a quadripartite presentation with input received from our partner organizations, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the World Organization for Animal Health, WOA. And I'm very happy that Emma Gardner from FAO actually joins us today as a panelist during the question and answer session, same as my colleague Hala Abu-Anaya from the WHO EMRO office, who is the MERS focal point there. So you've just seen this map. MERS-CoV, despite the name, is really a global threat. The reservoir hosts are dromedary camels, and from there, the virus sporadically spills over to humans. And the red areas on this map depict where this is usually happening. And as Maria said, from there, people are ready to travel. And so we really have to be prepared to pick up and to detect MERS-CoV cases in humans all over the world. Once this spillover happened to humans, onwards human-to-human transmission can occur, and we've observed this in healthcare settings mostly, but also in communities, for example, when people are caring for MERS-CoV patients and are in very, very close contact. To date, we don't have any licensed therapeutics or vaccines for MERS-CoV, and that's why it's included in the priority list for research and development that WHO is keeping. MERS-CoV is a reportable disease. For human cases, this is happening through the international health regulations, through the WHO. For animal cases, through the World Animal Health Information System, to WOA. And this is the timeline of MERS-CoV human cases right from its emergence in 2012. And you can see these very, very high peaks, which were healthcare associated human outbreaks. The last one's happening in 2015. The one in red is the one in the Republic of Korea that both Sylvie and Maria mentioned. And since then, significant changes in management and follow-up of cases and improvements in infection prevention and control, IPC, have resulted in reductions of secondary transmission. So you see these peaks are getting smaller and smaller, and then we have a real dip since 2020. This is, as you all know, when the COVID-19 pandemic was starting, and here are some thoughts as to why. So first of all, MERS and COVID-19 have similar symptoms, and we think that less severe MERS cases may have gone unnoticed, especially at the height of the pandemic. But also the measures implemented during the pandemic, like the lockdowns and social distancing, the mask wearing, will have prevented onwards transmission not only of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2, but also of MERS-CoV. And then there is a question that remains yet to be answered, if there's any cross-protectivity from SARS-CoV vaccination or infection for MERS. In camels, the MERS-CoV infection doesn't cause any clinical signs, and so we have to implement targeted studies in order to detect the virus in camels or antibodies against the virus. This is a map that the FAO produces. It shows in orange the camel density, and the yellow circles depict countries where such studies have been implemented. The bigger the circle, the more studies. And interestingly, when looking at the genetic makeup of the viruses found in different parts of the world, we can see that they can be distinguished into different clades, clade A and B, circulating in the Arabian Peninsula, and clade C in Africa. And Dr. Malik will tell us more about this later. This is work that the WHO is doing together with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation on the risk of MERS-CoV emergence and spillover. The darker the areas, the higher the risk, and the kind of variables going into this work are vegetation index, temperature, elevation, and aridity for the environmental suitability, but then also overlaying this with the susceptible camel populations and susceptible human populations. And when we compare these two maps, we can clearly see that there are areas in the world predicted to be at quite high risk of MERS-CoV emergence and spillover, where we have no investigations or studies conducted to date. So these are the ones with the question marks. So we have geographic data gaps that need to be filled. But we also have temporal data gaps, and this table shows you the full genome sequences that have been submitted to GeneBank over the past 5 years. And you can see the last sequence was submitted early 2020 by Kenya, and it's from a camel. And actually for the past 3 years, we have no sequence information, so we do not know what viruses are currently circulating, although we know there have been human cases because they were reported, and these are the yellow fields. And we also know that studies have been conducted and surveillance in camels, which are the green fields depicting 4 countries where FAO is supporting such surveillance. And so we really need representative data, and WHO calls upon countries to please share this information timely with the international community, because we need to do our global risk assessment. And at the moment, the data for MERS-CoV is very, very scarce. On a positive note, so this is information from the WHO genomic sequencing strategy, and it shows that by end of 2022, 163 out of the 194 WHO member states have actually acquired sequencing capability. And this is great news. And obviously, these capabilities and capacities need to be maintained and sustained. We can now use them for other pathogens as well, like MERS-CoV. And another important point where WHO supports countries is to build the bioinformatic capacities as well. So it's not enough to generate good quality sequences, but then we also need to have capacities to analyze them and make sense out of the analysis and translate that into action. These are some tools that are available, and I'd like to share with you on how to conduct surveillance in humans and camels. WHO is currently updating the protocols for MERS-CoV surveillance, and this is largely based on lessons learned from COVID-19, but also on additional information generated on MERS-CoV over the past years. And they will now be included in the WHO Unity study protocols, which were highly successful under COVID-19. Interestingly, they were actually developed from the MERS-CoV protocols at the time, and now it's an iterative process. Now we include lessons learned under Unity studies in the MERS protocols. FAO have produced camel sampling guidance to ensure good quality samples for optimized MERS-CoV detection in camels. And as a quadripartite effort, we have developed study protocols for risk factor identification at the animal-human interface. Also, WOA was quite active on MERS-CoV, and they included quite recently a chapter in their terrestrial manual. Among other things, you can find the test methods available for diagnosis of MERS, and I should maybe mention at this point that the diagnosis of MERS is quite similar in camels and in humans. We use real-time RT-PCR for viral detection, and we use ELISA and neutralization assays for serology. We had the opportunity at the latest MERS conference in March this year to conduct a small workshop on a MERS-CoV multi-country outbreak simulation. And this really was very useful to highlight the importance of the One Health approach in not only investigating, but also preventing and controlling the zoonotic disease. And given the high demand, we're thinking of turning this into a fully fledged regional simulation exercise over a few days. Global collaboration on MERS between what used to be the tripartite organizations, now quadripartite, has been strong over the past decade and very effective. We have an agreed work plan where, among other things, we support countries for surveys in humans and animals. We have regular interagency coordination calls and keep the research agenda up to date. And we do this also by convening global technical meetings from time to time. The last one was in 2021, and you can see here the cover of the meeting report. It's available online if you're interested. The next one is actually planned for November this year in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And this is my last slide. I want to close with the global priorities that we still have for MERS-CoV. This is adapted from the recommendations of our 2021 MERS meeting. So you've heard it: increased surveillance in humans, in camels, in Middle East and Africa, but also in South Asia, in all these areas where we have data gaps. Also integrate MERS-CoV into surveillance for respiratory pathogens more generally, for example, by applying multi-pathogen testing at surveillance sites. And then leverage from the scientific and collaborative achievements of the COVID pandemic. And last but not least, the One Health approach, again, highlighting how important it is to really come up with effective interventions and feasible, acceptable interventions to reduce zoonotic risk at the interface. And part of this is timely data sharing between sectors, ideally set up and tested in peacetime, so trust can be established and mechanisms are running when they're mostly needed in emergency. And this is actually a perfect segue to Dr. Emmad's presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sylvie. Over to Dr. Emmad.
Thank you very much. Just to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you. First, thank you for inviting me. I am so glad to be here today to talk about one of the most important topics here in Saudi Arabia, one of the top priority disease, and we have a lot of experience, learn from MERS, help us in the COVID, and I hope by sharing this experience with all of you to learn from this and build on it in our preparedness plan. And we will focus more today in One Health approach implementation during the journey of Saudi Arabia to response to MERS. First, the One Health approach is collaborative, integrated approach, focus more in human, animal, and environmental health. It's based on better communication and by multiple disciplinary sector, including public health, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, and also the academia, seeking to improve the health and well-being for all these three domains. During the response for MERS outbreak in the 2012 and the years after that, the Saudi Arabia focused more in improve the preparedness and the infection control practice in healthcare facilities. So there is a lot of work done in this area. First, in all healthcare facility subjected to number of accreditation. We have a self-reported preparedness tool for MERS. Each facility should report it weekly, and it's reviewed by the General Directorate in the Ministry of Health. Also, we have a program called Infection Control Auditing Program. It's have a lot of standards regarding to infection control, and it's visited all health facilities 2 times per year to ensure that all standards met, and if there is no some standard not met, there is action plans set to increase the preparedness of the all facilities. Also, there is an independent body, it's called Saudi Center Board for Accreditation of Healthcare Institute, are subjected to unannounced visit to all healthcare facilities to be sure that the infection control measure it's taken. Also, we have updated standard policy and guideline regarding to MERS. It's and for healthcare worker, it's have updated protocol for sharing sample and sharing and notification for all all cases, and also receive documented continuous job-specific infection control training on MERS and COVID with competencies assessment. This is the typical flow chart for MERS suspected and confirmed cases after taking the sample from the patient and confirm it in the regional lab. If it's positive, the rapid response team investigate immediately the case and conduct contact tracing. And if there is any contact with animal, they send immediate notification for Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture team deploy the investigation and take sample from camels if there is any direct contact with the camels. So the result of these samples from the camels and the result of the samples from the patient was gene sequence and match if there is any spillover from camels directly to the patient, or the patient take the infection from other source. So if the notification was received from Ministry of Agriculture, the epidemiologic team conduct urgent outbreak investigation within 24 hours and take a sample from 10 animals that had close contact with confirmed human cases. And if there is different type of animals, 5 samples from each kind of this animal. Since the emerging of indication of possibility of animal have role in the transmission of MERS to human, Ministry of Agriculture collaborate directly with the Public Health Authority, with the Ministry of Health to determine the prevalence of MERS MERS viruses in farm animal through many studies, and also implement a lot of awareness campaign, and recently established WIQA Center, which is National Center for Prevention and Control of Plants, Pets, and Animal Disease, and that work closely with Public Health Authority to deal with any zoonotic and vector-borne disease. This is some of activities of the team from agriculture field. As we said, do a lot of investigation, do active screening for camels that participate in festival and national events, and also do genomic sequencing, and a lot of implement some isolation quarantine for the positive camels and awareness campaign for that. There is some challenge now. There is no routine surveillance, only they investigate the camels with contact with positive cases, and only for camel gathering festival. This is the data from 167 notification from MERS. They conduct the investigation, and 68 reported have been assessed that have close contact with camel. 30% of these camels was found positive for MERS. Also, regarding to field study to animal farm, in 2014, the Ministry of Agriculture conduct field work on imported camels from Somalia and Sudan and Djibouti, and the result was 86% it was positive for antibody and 0% for screening virus. And also in 2014 and 2015, a lot of work conducted in 5 regions. In Saudi Arabia, more than 32,000 samples was obtained and tested. 81% of these sample was positive for antibodies, and almost 3% was positive for antigen. In these 2 studies, Riyadh was highest in the spread of the viruses, and also the highest, it's highest in newborn less than 1 year in the camels. Also, risk factor identify region distribution can be considered as a predictor for MERS, and focus more on this region to preventive measure. The conclusion was high prevalence, as we say, 8% of these camels was positive for MERS, and half of these was found in livestock market, and it's in winter season, and for younger age of animals. And 10 of these cases was correlated between these viruses and positive case in human. This provide the evidence that some of these cases take this infection from the camels. Also, there is a continuous awareness activities from the Ministry of Agriculture toward take this all opportunity to increase the awareness regarding to the MERS disease and other diseases during livestock market, animal farms, owner gathering places, and also in pet clinics, either governmental or private, using all tools for awareness, because some of these camel owners didn't have or didn't reach the social media, so try to increase the awareness or deliver the message through different tools, especially the visit of this community, and try to provide the awareness regarding to protect themselves and their family from the spillover of the viruses, and didn't push about that the camels is the only reason for the infection, but just to increase the compliance of these people who are dealing with camels to take the preventive measure during their work. Also, during 2012 and 2013, only one unconfirmed and confirmed cases was reported for MERS, and there is because the lack of adequate surveillance system and resource limited country it's hard to identify pathogens with long incubation period and such as MERS. And all these years after that, there is no reporting MERS cases during Hajj season, even in Saudi Arabia or after the pilgrims went back to their country. In 2015, the statement was issued by the government, and they banned slaughter of camels in Hajj season after a surge in death from MERS viruses in 2012. And also, camels were not allowed to enter any camel gathering or festival unless it's screened and tested for MERS. And I think this implemented also in Qatar and United Arab Emirates. Recently, there is a committee after COVID established the committee. It's multi-sectorial, using the whole governmental approach to dealing with all pandemic and epidemic. And one of these file was presented to this committee, the preparedness regarding to MERS, and it's implement the One Health approach, because all sector was participate in take decision, and if there is any challenge, we can escalate directly to this committee, and from this committee to center of government to provide all needed support. And this make all effort is collaborative, and the communication channel is always it's open. For future pandemic, as my colleagues said, we take this experience and for MERS and COVID to prepare for next pandemic. Saudi Arabia used all their experience during MERS, and it's utilized this during the first year of COVID. The whole hospital was prepared. A lot of frontliners have adequate training to deal with respiratory pathogens, and the lab was equipped, and all this infrastructure was established. So it's helped us to better response for COVID pandemic. And I think with our experience in MERS and COVID, it helped us to better planning for next threats. Also improve rapid response capacity and coordination containment plan for emergency pathogen, and also strengthen the integrated program to monitor and prevent emergent infection. There is effort now Saudi Arabia to build integrated surveillance system that build all sectors together to better response for emerging disease. Also strengthen laboratory capacity to help in early identify and characterize the emerging pathogen, including genome sequencing. I hope to highlight all this success story from Saudi Arabia with you, and offer to you. Thank you.
Over to our next presenter, Dr. Malik.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my task is to highlight the major questions of public health importance in regard to MERS. We have learned a lot over the last decade and a bit, but there are a number of major knowledge gaps, and I just want to highlight a few of them. So here again, you see this map of places where MERS has been detected in camels. And this also is the distribution of camels across the world, spreading into Central Asia. Wherever dromedary camels have been found, MERS coronavirus has been found, with one exception in Kazakhstan and in Australia, where MERS is not found in dromedary camels. In Mongolia, there are Bactrian camels, and they are also not infected with MERS. So one of the key puzzles is that 70 to 80% of the dromedary camels in the world are found in Africa. That is East Africa, North and West Africa. And in fact, only 4% of the global dromedary camel population is found in the Arabian Peninsula. But no human cases of MERS have been infection or disease has been reported from Africa. Travelers have been reported, but not human disease. So what is the reason for that? Now, you can think of a number of possibilities. As I told you, there is evidence of infected animals, and the extent of infection in Africa is comparable to that what is found in, for example, in Saudi Arabia or in other parts of the Middle East. So the animals are there and they are infected. Now, is there a difference in the exposure of humans to these camels? And a number of studies looking at the interaction in Africa, in for example, Morocco and Nigeria, clearly shows there's very close interaction. So it's not a lack of exposure of humans to camels. Is there evidence of infection in Africa? And here, there are a number of seroepidemiological studies that have been carried out. And what you can see is that there is evidence by neutralizing antibody, confirmed evidence, at least in some of these studies, that infection is taking place. So this is in Morocco, and a couple of studies in Kenya, for example, with evidence of antibody positivity. And then a camel herding population that was followed up over 2 years. They even found evidence of PCR positivity, but these people were asymptomatically infected with MERS. Now, when we look at this type of serological data, you have to keep in mind that seroconversion even in PCR confirmed mild or asymptomatic MERS infection. So this is confirmed, laboratory confirmed MERS infection. If it's mild or asymptomatic, seroconversion can be negative or very short-lived. So these seroprevalence data are likely to be a major underestimate. And there was a study done in Saudi Arabia, which did show that people who are PCR confirmed can have no antibody, but can have T-cell responses specific for MERS. So because of that, we carried out a study in abattoir, a camel abattoir in Nigeria, and using T-cell responses, we can find that about 1/3 of these individuals who are exposed to camels, and we know that these camels are carrying MERS, had evidence of T-cell immunity to MERS coronavirus. So it does suggest that infection of humans is not uncommon in Africa. But I must mention that this particular study is the only such study yet, and this certainly needs confirmation. Right, so I think I've tried to convince you that infection is taking place. Now, why don't we see reported disease? Is the virus the same? And I don't want to confuse it with too much of technical detail, but you know these family trees of viruses. So if you put all the virus sequences that are available, the viruses from the Arabian Peninsula cluster into this part of the tree, that is clade B and clade A. And all the viruses from Africa, and that is East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, cluster into this separate clade. But they are very, very similar, more than 99% nucleotide similar. So because of that, we were asking the question whether the viruses from the African continent behave differently in experimental systems. So it shows virus isolates from Ethiopia, Egypt, Morocco, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Kenya. And we carried out a number of laboratory tests. And this is human lung ex vivo cultures. This is not just cell lines. This is actual human lung removed from patients for operative purposes, which we use for experimental studies, and we can maintain them in culture. And the bottom line is, if you compare the viruses from Saudi Arabia, you can see there's very good replication. But all, in fact, 6 viruses that were tested from Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Morocco, and Egypt have significantly lower replication. It is not no replication, but lower replication. So is this of importance in terms of potential disease severity? Now, again, we did a similar study in a mouse model for MERS, and essentially we had the same result in the mouse lung, in this human DPP4 transduced mouse. Essentially, the African viruses replicate less efficiently than the viruses from Saudi Arabia. So there does seem to be a difference in behavior of these African viruses. The other question then is, does this, how does this affect the camels? Now, clearly, the virus in Africa is transmitting very efficiently. Seroprevalence rates is very high, 80%, 90% if you're looking at adult camels. So it is transmitting well. But in this study that was done by Sigalis and others in Barcelona in their BSL-4, infecting llamas as a closely related animals to camels, what they found was that the African virus, this is just one Egyptian virus, replicated to a lower extent and to a shorter period of time compared to the Saudi virus. So there does also seem to be lower replication competence in camels or the camelid group of animals. So this would suggest that the fitness of MERS coronavirus for camels, the clade B viruses that are found in Saudi Arabia are much more fit even to infect and transmit than the viruses in Africa. And this may explain why the clade C viruses, keep in mind the highest density, the largest number of dromedary camels is in this part of the world, and they are carrying infection. And these are exported into the Arabian Peninsula. And I think the previous speaker mentioned that some of the shipments of camels that come in are found to be infected. And invariably, they'll be carrying clade C viruses. But up to now, clade C virus has not got established in Saudi Arabia. So this fitness difference may explain why the clade C virus is unable to get a foothold. Even though it is being introduced, it doesn't get a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula, which already has clade B virus. But there is a danger then that if the clade B virus from the Arabian Peninsula gets into the African continent, it may dominate. It is better. It is more fit. That's what we think. That it will basically take over. And then, of course, there could be zoonotic implications of that. So what I've tried to summarize is that in terms of the virus, they are genetically distinct, the African viruses. There is differences in replication in human lung, in mouse lung, and also in camels. And it may explain why severe human disease is not being visible or not being recognized. But equally, I have also shown or tried to show you that infection is taking place. So if infection is taking place, a virus may adapt to more efficient human transmission. Now, this is another important point, and I don't worry about the data, but the point I'm trying to make is that of the African viruses, more than 2/3 of them have deletions in different parts of their genome. You can see this is one particular gene, the ORF3 gene, This is the full gene, and here there's a hole here, there's a gap. Here there are three gaps, etc., and so on. So the virus in Africa seems to be genetically unstable. And why are we worried about that? Because if you go back to SARS in 2003 or 2002, when it was jumping to humans from these game animal markets, the virus that adapted to efficient human transmission finally had acquired a deletion in one of these genes, and this is in SARS coronavirus 2. So when viruses acquire insertions or deletions, it might lead to unpredictable changes in the virus behavior. And then finally, we have evidence of MERS coronavirus in Central Asia, but we have very little. There's only one partial sequence available from Pakistan. So we really need much more sequence data and surveillance data from the Central Asian region. Now, finally, why MERS may not be detected, reported, is the question of recognition and diagnostics. When you think of the healthcare professionals in Africa, how aware are they that MERS is present in camel herding areas and that it may be causing mild or severe respiratory disease? And how many ILI or SARI surveillance sites are situated in the proximity of camel exposed populations? Most of them are situated in major cities. So really, we really need to think about more targeted surveillance for MERS in Africa and also in Central Asia. So just to summarize, I think you heard that MERS can transmit and can cause major outbreaks of disease, as you heard in Korea. This is the data from Korea. So from one introduction, it spread to over 180 cases. So there is human to human to human transmission. Now, just for comparison, with avian flu, we don't have human to human to human transmission. So MERS is something we really have to be concerned about. And the majority of MERS-infected dromedaries are in Africa, but why is there no reported zoonotic cases there? I think we should be really looking much harder. We need more surveillance at the places of risk, which are camel-human interfaces. And there's also gaps in surveillance and sequence data from Central Asia. And indeed, as was pointed out by Sophie earlier, there are very few MERS coronavirus sequences in public databases recently. And I think for all these reasons, MERS remains a pandemic threat, and we need more surveillance and the development of countermeasures. So with that, I just thank you for your attention. And I just want to point out that a lot of this work involved a lot of collaboration with many researchers and scientists across Africa. I don't have time to thank all of them, but and some of these studies, many of them, in fact, were coordinated and facilitated by WHO and FAO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malik and Dr. Emad. And I will be moderating the Q&A session, thanking all the participants for putting a lot of interesting questions already into the Q&A. I will call upon my dear colleagues to please answer some of them. First of all, I would like to ask Emma Gardner from FAO to give us some more insights on MERS-CoV in animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks everybody for your really interesting and excellent presentations. Before I answer the specific questions that were listed in the chat, I just want to follow up a little bit on Dr. Malik's presentation. And I think the argument for increasing surveillance, for understanding the changes, the evolution of the virus in Africa, he's made a very strong argument for that. And the need for that for early warning and for understanding what's going on is clear. But FAO is working in a number of countries in Africa to do risk-based surveillance. And so I think it's really important to communicate that MERS-CoV is really low priority for a lot of these countries. It doesn't cause disease in camels. And there's been no clinical cases in humans either that have originated from zoonotic transmission in Africa. And a lot of these countries in Africa have more immediate pressing concerns and priorities, both in terms of human diseases as well as animal diseases. And so I think the importance of One Health collaboration is necessary in order to increase the surveillance, because it's not going to be done, and global One Health collaboration, because it's not going to be done at the national level, at the animal health level, in these countries, because it's not an immediate concern. And so I think that's a really important message from this presentation and from this webinar, that we need to continue our collaboration and improve it. In terms of the questions that were asked in the chat regarding bat to camel transmission, there's been no documented evidence that MERS coronavirus, as we know it now, is in bats, that bats are infected with it. We don't really know how it got from bats to camels. And the natural history and ecology of MERS-CoV right now is really that dromedary camels are the reservoir species, and it circulates among dromedary camels and then is transmitted to humans. So as far as we understand and the evidence that we have now, bats are not actively involved in the natural history or the ecology of MERS-CoV. Similarly, with other livestock species, they've been shown to be infected, sort of sporadically isolated events when they're in close proximity to other camels. There's been no documented human to non-camel livestock species. And so their role is really thought to be very minor, if important at all. It's really between camels and humans. In terms of the natural progression of the infection in camels, experimental studies have shown that there is maybe a 1 to 2 day latency period after experimental inoculation, and then about 7 to 10 days of active shedding, and possibly longer in terms of camels may exhibit PCR positivity longer, but in terms of being able to culture the virus or in sort of shedding of infectious virus, that is thought to be around 7 to 10 days. The question of immunity following recovery in camels is a major question, and we still really don't understand the dynamics of that. There is evidence that camels can be reinfected. Whether they lose all immunity or partial immunity, it's really not known. It's a very difficult disease to understand in the natural course of infection, because camels don't exhibit overt clinical signs. So to understand these dynamics would require sort of long-term sampling of camels and field situations, and as you know, that's really difficult. And in terms of experimental conditions, camels are very expensive to keep, and so those experimental conditions really don't have the time frame that are long enough to understand these sort of long-term immunity dynamics. I hope I answered your questions, and back to you, Sophie.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. A lot of additional detail supplied, very grateful. I would like to pose the next question to Hala Awelnaya from our EMRO office. Hala, why do we see such a decrease in MERS-CoV human case reporting? Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for this question. Yes, actually, MERS surveillance, as other surveillances, have been disrupted in affected countries during COVID pandemic, where most critical national resources for MERS, like staff, supplies, hospitals, were all repurposed to COVID-19 response. So this might be one of the reasons. Another reason, and most important, not to forget, the prioritization of SARS-CoV-2 testing over other respiratory viruses, including MERS. Another possible reason may be changes in healthcare seeking behavior and health service delivery. Also, MERS cases might have been missed and were possibly not picked up due to similar clinical presentation to COVID-19, as this is understandable. On another level and opportunity, we can say from COVID, the enhanced infection prevention and control measures adopted for COVID-19 may have had a protective effect on MERS transmission in hospital settings. Last but not least, the application of public health measures during pandemic might have mitigated human-to-human transmission of MERS if it were to be present. So circulation of MERS-CoV in dromedary camels is still a fact. Therefore, while the number of cases of MERS has been reduced, the risk of zoonotic transmission remains. So as my previous colleagues have mentioned, WHO calls upon countries to remain vigilant, as MERS should still be regarded as priority threat, necessitating national, regional, international collaboration under the One Health approach. I hope I answered this question, Sophie. Back to you.
Thanks very much for these insights, Hala. There were a few questions on experiences from KSA, so I would like to turn over to Dr. Ahmad to answer these things.
Thank you, Sophie. There is a question about the preparedness for Camel Festival. Every year there is a task force from all relevant sector before the biggest annual festival for camels, King Abdulaziz Camels Festivals. We met and put a preparedness plan for MERS and other zoonotic diseases, including the testing testing for all camels before entering the gathering, and also the clinic and awareness campaign for all owner and herder for these camels, and sent also last year the SMS message for all attendees for this festival regarding to practicing some infection control measure, and if there is any symptoms, they should reporting to their doctor. They have visiting this festival to put it in priority for any testing or investigation. Also, we monitoring the activities during this event, and if there is any positive case of these camels, it's isolated in this special area, and we just try to mitigate the risk for this festival and encourage the owner for these camels to take proper action if there is any symptoms from these camels or symptoms from the herder. They work with them to just reporting to us, and we didn't affect the festival activities, but just put some preventive measure to keep this annual gathering continue and happen, and just mitigate the risk of the infection. And these communications always happen, and the awareness campaign, it would take this festival as an opportunity to deliver the proper message for all owner, and keep our communication and with them it's open. Regarding to invest in vaccine, MERS vaccine, there is a lot of efforts now. We have ambitious strategy to localize and development of vaccine, and we have also established a strategy for research with Ministry of Health Research Department, and this I think there is some research conducted in Saudi Arabia conclude the phase 1 in last 2 years, but the effort was interrupted by COVID pandemic. But the MERS vaccine is one of the top priority, and we can help and share all necessary information with any research group want to invest in this. And Saudi Arabia put the MERS as the top of the list for vaccine development. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much. And of course, all our eyes are on KSA when it comes to MERS, and we learn from your experience. I have in the chat a $1 million question to Malik. What is the risk of recombination between SARS-CoV-2 and MERS-CoV? Thank you, Malik.
Right, thank you for that question. So of course, there can be recombination in coronaviruses, and this does happen. But they generally are most often occurring with very closely related viruses. So in the sarbecoviruses, that is the SARS-1, SARS-2, and the related bat viruses, there's clear evidence of recombination taking place. Now, MERS is a bit distant, but not very far distant from SARS. So I think it is a possibility. And the way it would take place is if a human gets infected with MERS and SARS coronavirus 2 at the same time, that possibility does exist, but I think it's probably remote. The other possibility is, of course, if camels who carry MERS get infected with the SARS coronavirus 2, and indeed there have been studies looking at how often, whether or how often SARS coronavirus 2 infects camels. Not very often, but I think, Sophie, you were involved in some of those studies as well. You may want to comment. So I think that is the the short answer to your question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. And indeed, I was involved, I was previously working for FAO, so I was involved in some of these studies in the Middle East, trying to identify co-infection of camels with MERS and SARS coronavirus. So these study results still have to come out. I want to answer a couple of questions. There was one on the longevity of antibodies against MERS-CoV in humans. And indeed, there has been, again, an interesting study performed by KSA, and I will put the link in the chat in a minute. And they followed MERS cases over time doing serology, and they could see that actually antibodies started weaning already after 3 months, and only in few individuals they could be still detected after 6 months time. However, we don't know, that there's still questions out if the protection is only conferred by antibodies or also by cellular immunity. So there might actually be a strong component in MERS responsible for protection through cellular immunity, and that could not be detected through antibody detection. And so it's, there's still some research. I mean, for MERS-CoV, there's still many knowledge gaps. Another question on the cross protection that I also mentioned in my talk. I think the question is still unanswered if people who had MERS-CoV infections in the past would be protected against SARS-CoV-2, maybe still getting the infection, but maybe with much lighter symptoms, or vice versa. I hope the next months and years will tell us more about this. And actually, we had a discussion this morning with colleagues from KSA that this would be an interesting question to answer and to do some research on. I think we arrived at the end of our webinar, and I would like to hand back to Dr. Maria van Kerkhoop for the closing. Thank you so much for your interest and the interesting questions posed. And thanks to all the speakers for joining today.
Thank you, Sophie. And thanks everyone for joining on this, and to the excellent speakers, Sophie, Imad, Malik, Emma, Hala. I think one of the things we just want to show here is the collaborative nature by which we study MERS, one of the other coronaviruses that is in circulation that still poses a threat. We work across the different sectors in a truly One Health approach. All of these diseases, have this aspect of needing to work with multiple partners across different sectors, with academic groups, with public health agencies, with member states. And we need everyone's help to continue that collaboration, because there is so much to learn. In the last 10 years, we've learned so much about MERS coronavirus, but in the last 3.5 years, we've learned so much about another coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. And in making sure that we don't lose sight of MERS-CoV, we get a little bit smarter, more strategic, and utilize the limited resources that are available to improve surveillance, to make sure across the entire world, like across areas where, as Malik showed in the different maps, as Sophie showed, as Dr. Imad showed, that there are different risks, and there's different risks because of the virus itself. We need better surveillance in SARI sites and making sure that we're utilizing the testing appropriately. We're doing more sequencing and sharing those sequences so that we can understand the molecular epidemiology. We need much more investment. So there were a lot of questions on the vaccines, MERS coronavirus vaccines in camels. And there was a lot of work done prior to the pandemic, but we need to pick up that momentum again, working with our partners. And I saw that there was someone from CEPI online. We work very closely with CEPI and others around vaccine development. But where are we with all of this work? Where are we with the potential acceptance of this? Not just the science, but the potential acceptance of this in terms of vaccinating camels or vaccinating humans at risk. And we can't forget what we learned in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just the science, but it's the access, it's the affordability, it's the equity in the use of these life-saving tools. We need to be better at that at a global level. So we've learned a lot in the last 10 years of MERS coronavirus. We need to make sure that as we go forward, that surveillance is stronger for this pathogen in the context of COVID and flu and RSV and everything else. And there's still so much to learn. Every single speaker pointed out that we know a lot of this, but there's still a lot more that we need to do in terms of the research, in terms of understanding what this disease is in humans and what the virus does in animals. So let's keep up the momentum, and let's make sure that we don't forget about the foundation of science, collaboration, trust, transparency, and you really utilize this One Health approach. So also want to thank the EPI-WIN team, Lubika and Priya and everyone else for allowing us to have this space in your Wednesday webinars. We'll pass back to you for the final goodbyes. Thanks very much to all of our speakers.
Thanks. The same comes from us and from EPI-WIN team and all the people who are helping us to have this Wednesday EPI-WIN webinars. Special thanks to Priya, Jamfang, Brian, Vinny, Andre, Ophelia, Supriya team, and under the leadership of Dr. Sylvie Briand. Having said that, we hope to see you next week for another EPI-WIN webinar that will be on the zoonotic diseases and One Health approach. So please come and join us. And thank you all. Thank to all the speakers and my colleagues. Thank you. Bye all.